Tonebenders, the Sound Designers Podcast. Let's do this.
Hello and welcome to Tonebenders, where we talk with the sonic artists behind our favorite films, games, and series. My name is Tim Muirhead, and I will be your host today, and joining me is René Coronado. It's great to talk to you today, René.
Hey, Tim. Long time.
Yeah, it has been a little while. It's great to have you back.
Right.
Today we're going to be talking about a pretty amazing new sound effects library that has just come out called Cataclysm. We have three of the people behind this project here to talk with us. First up, we have Mattia Cellotto, whom listeners might recall from our roundtable episode about recording animals from not too long ago. I think this library is mostly the brainchild of Mattia. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Good to be back.
Awesome. Also joining us are Fraser and Robbie Elias, who are both field recordists for this collection. Kyle, it's great to meet you and have you on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Awesome. Robbie is someone that I've been aware of for many years and interacted with a bunch online. I think, René, that's the same for you. But this is my first time actually speaking with him. So it's a great pleasure to finally have you on Tonebenders, Robbie. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm a big fan. I've been listening for many years, and, it's exciting to be here.
Awesome, thanks. Mattia, do you want to give us a quick overview of what Cataclysm is and how you found your way to collaborating with Kyle and Robbie?
Yeah, definitely. So the library started as a collection of a series of recording sessions of loud sounds that happened to be in environments that sounded pretty interesting. From there, I took a break from recording and I started working with synthesized sounds to see if I could recreate reflections that felt as natural as possible. And most times I failed, but I created things that maybe were a little bit more hyper-realistic or surreal in a way. And from there, I got back to old passions such as other recordists' libraries like Frank Bree's Gun Tales. In that library, there's a lot of content that sounds super interesting in the later part of the sounds. I wanted to create something like that. I wasn't really sure how I could do it. I was pretty sure that even if I tried, I would end up with something else because of the environments that I would be finding myself in. So I got back to recording, trying to find places that were unique. And luckily, being from Italy, I found a lot of places in the mountains where I thought I could get great signal to noise ratio and ideally just incredible late reflections for mountain ranges slapping back the original signal. So from there, I tried to do a research and I found a number of places that I could access in Italy. But halfway through that research, I thought that I would still be limited to an extent. And a thought came to mind about what sort of triggered part of the experiments, which was seeing a propane cannon recording video from 343 for Halo. So I got in touch with Robbie and we talked about locations. We talked about some of the areas that I had in my head as the perfect location with regards to what something could look like and ideally you'd associate a sound to. So Robbie had an easier access to these locations than myself, and he introduced me to Kyle, and together we found a few more locations to record in the US. I limited my recording sessions to Italy, Sweden, and Denmark for my part. And so, from there on, there was also a collaboration with Joe Ford for the synthesized section, some contributions for the design sections, and it all sort of came together. And I had a couple of descriptors in terms of inspirations for the library. There's things like God of War, Dune, Arrival, Returnal, a bit of Star Wars in there. There's just a lot of things that have inspired me in long to short run in terms of recent years. Yeah, it sort of collided with this collection because I wanted to try and capture as much as possible in ways that felt, I say, consequential in the sense that I wanted to make even small sounds feel like they could destroy a planet, if that makes sense. So they're the idea for Cataclysm ultimately being wrapped together in this kind of collection, yeah.
So as you were, I guess, planning out locations, can you talk a little bit about what the process was to get access to these locations that are going to give you these big giant reverb tails?
Yes. I can talk about the failure and I can talk about the few successes that allowed me to go to the places that I went to. The failures were just in the first emails. Not being used to having to deal with the location managers and being very optimistic about what I thought could be done. I had access to a website that, at least in Italy, provided information about a location and whether it could be used for shooting movies or, linear media of any kind. And from there, I thought, okay, if these locations are already set up for the job, then it should be very easy for me to go with a I guess perhaps a smaller budget, but also smaller demands, and ideally make something happen. And at the time I thought, well, that could happen with explosives, or it could happen with a propane cannon. Originally, I didn't even consider the propane cannon as the main option. So I would really try and push for explosions via emails by saying, hello, I'm Italian, but I'm not in Italy right now. Blah, 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 explosions, blah, 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 risk assessment, blah, 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 insurance, blah, 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 blah. I have money though. And that really didn't work at all. So the second kind of batch of emails went out as something along the lines of, all in all, it's about 30 seconds of noise. It's an environmental response recording to try and capture the sonic beauty of Italy and so on and so forth. A little bit more of a massaged, message, if you will. And that helped quite a lot. But still, I had to send out about 100 emails to places that I thought would be suitable, or location managers that were connected to places that I thought would be suitable. And ultimately, I got 3 or 4 locations that way. And then luckily, I had a couple of connections in some areas where I normally go to. The main ones that I'm really happy that I was able to access were the Carrara white marble caves, just because they are so iconic looking, and luckily turned out to be also quite iconic sounding, because they have these insanely dense early reflections, and the late reflections are not as pingy as you would expect in a mountain range because of the lucidity that comes with marble, and how, it's such a reflective material. So yeah, it was email exchanges for most of the time. And whenever we managed to make this work in conjunction with explosives rather than propane cannons, it was a bit of a pain, because then all of a sudden a pyrotechnics company needed to cover the insurance side of things, as well as bringing, flash powder to the session. And in conjunction with that, of course, the location manager needed to green light every single part of that setup. So that turned out to be very complicated. It took about 3 months to organize a session that ultimately was 7 hours long or something like that. And for each one of these sessions, I also wanted a plan B in terms of, in case of bad weather, etc. So that added the level of complication. I ended up using every single plan B date that I had for this collection. So I'm happy that I did it, but it did add that kind of headroom of complication.
So we've mentioned a phrase a few times now, propane cannon. For those who don't know what that is, which until this came along was me, Robbie, maybe do you want to explain what a propane cannon is?
Yeah, sure. A propane cannon is something that Kyle and myself found on the internet one day. It was used by airports a lot to scare off birds, also known as a bird cannon, but it doesn't fire birds of any kind or anything. Basically, it can fire on intervals, so it can fire every 30 seconds, or you can have it just do a one-off shot, and it fills up with propane, and then it ignites it, and it creates a loud bang. And it's just a little bit easier to work with than working with explosions. Like it was described, when you want to do an explosion session, you got to get permissions, you got to do a bunch of stuff. If you're using propane cannon, you kind of just show up to a location, you fire it off a couple times, and you take off. So it's a lot easier to set up. It's a lot easier to get out there and get a good recording. And then, the setup takes about like a minute or 2 minutes kind of thing. So after hearing all that talk about locations, Kyle and I, we live in Washington, so everybody likes guns here and, blowing stuff up. So it's a lot easier to just show up in a nice spot, capture the rapport of the location, and then take off. It's just something that when we were working on Halo, we started using, and we've just never stopped using it. It's a little bit easier than firing guns with blanks or doing explosion session.
Does it push like just a compression wave of air out of the front of the cannon, or like how does it work?
Kyle, I'll let you take the logistics of that.
Yeah, that's essentially it. It basically just ignites the propane that's inside it, and then it sends out just like a burst of air, essentially. It excites the environment.
So like from a safety perspective, you still have to kind of stay away from the front of it?
If you were in front of it as it went off, you would be fine. I mean, it's probably smart to be behind it, but it's a fairly safe mechanism for, capturing those types of sounds.
And how big is it?
Probably about 2-3 feet long, I'd say.
And the barrel can extend too. It actually changes the sound base. So if you extend the barrel all the way out, it's a little bit sharper sounding. And if you bring it in, it's a little bit boomier sounding.
Yeah, we've also experienced in the past taking different types of like PVC piping and attaching it to the barrel. You can make it even longer or kind of have it expand out. And so it has kind of a wider bore, and it completely changes the overall sonic character of it.
Yeah, there was a session we did in LA once where we stuck it in a storm drain and it made the biggest boom. Kind of like a space cannon is what it sounded like. I've always tried to recreate that after that day, but it was probably the best recording I got from it.
I like how you mentioned it as portable, which is fair enough. Having seen the footage of you two going around with a car, in my case, I would hike with this up a mountain for my recording sessions. And the cannon is not even the worst part. It's the actual propane tank that goes with it, which I think the lightest you can get is about 7 kilos. And the propane cannon that I had was probably another 7 or something like that. Not easily fittable in a backpack, I'd say. So it just kind of ended up being a little bit messier for me.
So you're hiking up a mountain with a propane tank, a cannon, and all of the recording gear. That limits what you can bring, I would think. Let's start with you, Mattia. What were you using to record?
Yeah, that's a great question. For some sessions, I had the chance to bring so much more than I needed. And for sessions like those where I had to hike for about 2 hours, I just had to use a lot of small portable recorders handheld. I've indulged myself to get 2 Sony D100s for this library. So now I have 2 of those. A Roland RO5, if I remember correctly, and a couple of other recorders that I would place strategically to get as many perspectives as possible, even with limited amount of inputs. I would always try to bring either the F3 or a mixed pre 10T. The mixed pre was pretty much always present, but at that point I would connect it to a micro Uzi, Uchos, whatever is smallest. MKH 8040s would always be in the setup as well. I think the Sennheiser mics are pretty much a constant throughout the library. Even when we were talking with Robbie and Kyle at the beginning, there were a couple of mics and recorders that I thought would be great to have on both ends so that we would have some form of consistency. The D100 and the 8040 were the ones that I pushed for. Maybe one thing that is sort of fun to mention is at some point in early phase of the production of the library, we were talking with Robbie about the 8070. That mic doesn't get a whole lot of usage in sound effect recording because it's a low bar cardioid kind of mic. I think you use it for recording soccer player hitting a football in a stadium. It has really mega reach, but at the same time, generally you don't need something like that. But Robbie mentioned that placing it more than 100 meters away from the source of the sound and pointing towards the reflection point. So, imagine yourself at the center of a mountain range, take 100 meters worth of steps and then place the mic looking away from the source into a mountain range. So when we started talking about that, I thought, it'd be cool to try with a stereo setup. So I also brought these 2 super long mics as a main setup as well. And that really allowed for a super wide stereo image. So that was also fun to bring around. Well, it wasn't fun to bring around. It was nice to listen back to, yeah.
Yeah, that actually has a huge effect. I've done that for a long time also, kind of breaking down explosions into the parts, which is your kind of concussive impact at the high, the mids and the lows, and then also just the reflections, and like dedicating microphones and channels to just the reflections can yield really great benefits sometimes.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the 8070. I've had it for many years, and I basically bought it just for that. It's just to take to gun sessions or explosion sessions and point it away from the source, usually around trees, because you tend to hear the sound come back through the trees, and that's how you get some nice tail sounds, and you can get tails get in the direct sound with other mics and stuff like that. So it's a fun mic, but it's also super long and a real big pain to travel with. It also has a really good signal to noise ratio, which makes it a really strong contender for a tail mic, because then you get more of the sound before the noise comes in, so you have less noise reduction to do when you're trying to pull that tail out.
Mattia, you had 2 of them? You were setting them up in what, XY, AB?
Wide or RTF. So yeah, they would be even sometimes 4 or 5 meters apart. And I don't think I would even call it RTF really. It was more of, I'll just point one of them at the closest mountain that will reflect back the first sort of late reflections set. And the other one will be pointed at a different mountain that ideally will have different timing. So that's kind of how it tend to work. And it worked pretty well. I would just sort of base it on what I was hearing on the spot. If I could hear the reflections move in the range from right to left, I would just try and pick the spot where I heard the beginning and the spot where I heard the end. By the way, when we're talking about size and them being cumbersome, that's without the blimps, because then, open mount, and of course you want that protection as well. So yeah, very, very cumbersome, but I think definitely worth it for that kind of thing. Especially like Robbie said, the signal to noise is pretty good in the mic itself. So you just need to find a location that respects that or that makes that shine, right? I remember coming back from one recording session, listening back and being able to crank so much of that mic in post, thinking, I don't even think that it was that good in real life, which is something that I rarely say because generally the impression you get in real life is deeply more personal.
Hey everyone, I'm going to interrupt this talk real quick to let you know about the sound design meetups coming up in Toronto and New York City. They're going to be really fun evenings for the sound community in both cities to hang out, tell stories, connect with old friends, and meet some new people. 7 p.m. on September 26th in Toronto at the Pilot near Bay and Bloor, and New York listeners get ready on 7 p.m. on October 26th at the Crompton Ale House in Chelsea. Full details available at tonebenderspodcast.com. Okay, back to recording explosions.
Did you guys bring any like stunt mics or mics that you kind of intended to run into distortion and just folding back on themselves?
Yeah, we'd kind of go bigger than probably we needed to because we'd want to try to get as much coverage as possible. And so we'd usually kind of have like two setups close to the actual Canon so we could kind of get that close perspective, get the very deep cussive layer from it. And usually one of the arrays in there, we would kind of let it clip a bit harder, which is nice to have because we record at 32-bit. And so we'd usually always just normalize it down when we send it over to Mattia. Then we'd always have quite a few different FAR arrays that we'd have running the same things, like the 8020s, 8040s, Micro Uzis, Uzis Pros, 8070s, then the Sanken CO100Ks.
Yeah, I think I ran stereo Sanken C100Ks and then 2 stereo Uzi Pro rigs, Micro Uzis, and the 8070, which is kind of a light rig actually for me and Kyle, because usually we'll have about 10 to 12 mics each on a large gun session, but we had to be more portable, and that was our version of portable. Interesting you mentioned the foldback thing, because actually the best recording I ever got with my 8070, I was using an outboard pre, just one of those old sound devices ones, and I somehow compressed the signal. I don't know what I did, and I managed to get one of the most beautiful like just rolling tail sounds from that.
Yeah,
I've always tried to recreate it. I never have, but because it was 8070, because the signal to noise was so quiet, it really salvaged the recording and it just came something special. So like sometimes you get happy accidents.
Yeah, like a lot of times you'll just be using your phone or whatever shooting video, and just that mic and those cheap electronics and that level of compression will do like a very aggressive, interesting thing sometimes that is cool to add to the pristine stuff.
Yeah, and because they're off axis too, you get less of that sharp initial transient and you get more of a rounder sound, I guess. So you get a nice roll and tail from it. I used to record with Brian Watkins a lot with Kyle, and he would use some stuff too that was similar to that to get some nice compression in the field. And something I haven't used enough of, but I'd like to explore more in the future kind of thing.
Yeah, I was going to say those old sound devices, those 442s and stuff like that, they have the built-in transformers in it. And so when you hit them hard, they really saturate pleasantly.
And it's also worth mentioning, too, with 32-bit, one of the other reasons besides just avoiding the clip with it is you have more flexibility when noise reducing, too. So when you're working in that higher dynamic range, you can definitely reduce more of the noise without artifacting your signal too much, which is really nice about that.
And talking about this really makes me think about all of the processing that happened after. Not having that kind of compression and natural, let's say, smoothing of the sound into a more mid-focused range meant that in post everything felt quite bright. And I'm thinking back to, instead of the explosions, the tree cutting sessions, we're having the 8050s and 8040 pointing straight at the cracking point of the tree made for such disappointment coming back home and realizing that my phone sounded a lot fuller. The recording of the phone sounded a lot fuller than what I got out of the super kind of crisp mics, which sort of makes sense. And so then you start using transient designers, EQs or dynamic EQs, and all sorts of things to try and bring it back down to something that has that high frequency detail briefly in the transients, but also that ultimately feels as big as you thought it should be. That's one of the things that I think is interesting to think about, because you sort of get it not exactly for free when you work with a high compression or limiters or things like those, but then you have less flexibility. And I tend to be obsessed about wanting to make the choice in post and only wanting to worry about the recording when recording and getting something that is flexible later on. So yeah, the time that didn't go into finding the best compression limiting solution for recording definitely went into the post-processing part.
Can you talk about how long you stayed in 32-bit and at what point you brought it down for the purposes of post, and kind of what your post process was?
I think I stayed in 32 throughout processing. So until the very end in Reaper, all of the files would be 32-bit. And then only in the final bounds, I would just export it to 24, just for the sake of course, having it as a commercial library without needing people to make any adjustments of any kind, if that makes sense. That's pretty much true for every single thing that I've recorded on the library. It does, of course, take longer to do any processing, especially like destructive processing in RX. But at the same time, again, that flexibility, I'm never really sure how much I'm going to push a tail. Sometimes I will bake some gain, but it might not be enough. So I find myself gluing the file over and over, still in 32-bit, but trying to find the way that it will sort of feel as big as possible without doing any of the, actual processing.
Do you want to talk about how you picked the locations? Kyle, had you been to where you recorded before, and can you describe them a little bit?
So when we first kind of started on this, Mattia's brought a lot of good reference material for us to kind of start off with. And so when we listened to that, kind of had a location in my mind of like, okay, this is where I know where we need to go. We recorded there like 5-6 years ago, this perfect rocky terrain to give perfect reflections, which we're trying to achieve. When we go out there, it was like about a 4-hour drive. I think we went out there the night before. And so we could get up at like 5 a.m. and start recording. When we drove out there, the landscape just completely changed. There was like tons of RVs and trailers and horses running around. And so we're like, oh, damn, we can't record here. And so we ended up driving around for probably like 6 hours, just trying to find a good location of recording. And we finally found an open woodland type environment, which wasn't at all ideal of what Mattia was looking for. But, we had to record something. And so we did a huge session there. We sent that to him. And it wasn't horrible material, but definitely wasn't what we were striving out for. And so we went back to the drawing board. And what we did was kind of digged into Google Earth, this app called Free Roam, which I could then be able to survey all the geography and be able to see, okay, is this public land? Is this the Bureau of Land Management? Do they own this? We kept running into issues where we'd be stumbling onto someone's property. If you're setting off loud bangs, you don't want someone being like, oh, come out with their shotgun or something like that. And so, we're trying to be on the side of caution quite a bit. And so we ended up finding out in the George area, kind of northeastern Washington, it's like a very popular rock climbing area. And so we went out there one morning. In the winter, it was about 20 degrees Fahrenheit. We're thinking, okay, this is going to be a perfect location to record and should be pretty quiet. I can't imagine there being that many people. It's so cold. Who's going to want to rock climb? There were dozens and dozens of people there camping and rock climbing. And we're like, oh, shit. So we ended up just going and just start recording. And we would just go and try to get off as many rounds as we could and try not to scare the people climbing. Just that whole area was kind of a gold mine because there was all these different canyons and there was like a huge river that kind of runs through. And so you just have these really nice lush valleys that we could just kind of set up and record. We'd usually set up real quick, set off like 10 rounds, then just jump to another place. We probably did like 6 locations that one day. Then we would also just try to do some crowdsourcing from people that we know of like, hey, you know of any good locations? I have any private property? One of our colleagues, their parents had just kind of a nice residential property that was on a private lake. And that was probably my favorite recording that we did. When you set off around on that, you could just hear the reflections just travel all throughout the lake and come back. And it was just absolutely massive.
Yeah.
And so we did that, and then we're like, oh, let's do something like this again. And so we found another lake a few miles from there, did another recording there. And yeah, that gave us a good portion of, the content that we were able to deliver to Mattia.
Yeah, I feel like I'm listening to Santa describing how my gifts were packed, because when you came back from that recording session in Quincy, I remember taking a listen to the first assets and being like, all right, yes. And then going deeper and deeper in the session, going, oh my God. Continuing. And then I asked Robbie and Kyle to shoot some videos as well for the session so that I could then use them for putting together the trailer for the library. And I think the most stunning shots came out of that session. There are so many, one in particular with a sunset and the propane cannon in view. It was incredible. It's so nice when you're not going out yourself, but you're provided with so much material that inspires you, that you are as motivated as if you actually were there recording the material yourself, in the sense that sometimes, it becomes a desk job when it's in the post side of things. But for these recordings, really, it's been amazing. And yeah, Lake Joy was also great. I had those dense tales translating into the distant trees and then coming back. It was a super articulated kind of tale that I don't think I've ever heard before. So many unique tales for anyone that will ultimately make use of the library. Most of what we talked about for the Quincy session will be named Canyon, or will have the word Canyon. Lake Joy, I think, will simply be called like Forest Lake, I believe. But yeah, a lot of amazing content there that was super flexible, yeah. And a lot of great perspectives too. I think for most of the Quincy recordings, I could just mute half of the mics and have an export that I would call, for example, the top of the canyon, and then unmute the other. So pretty much do a upside down kind of thing for the takes and create something completely different, because there were so many perspectives. And again, the signal to noise was really good. I think it's just some crows here and there or whatever, like Kyle mentioned, it was a little bit tricky to find the perfect noise floor for that area maybe, but I think it was still great. After just fixing a couple of things, everything sounded so nice almost right away. I had to do so little on those. Really good.
Yeah, the Quincy one was really funny, actually, because we showed up at this majestic place with these tall stone pillars, and it formed kind of like a horseshoe, which you kind of want sometimes because it reflects the sound and sends it out. And we were setting up, and I was like, Kyle, I'm going to go hike up a little bit and see what's on the other side of these rock pillars real quick before we get started. And I hiked up, and I went around, and there was just like 30 RVs on the other side of it. And I was like, oh, okay, Kyle, we can't record here. And of course, Kyle doesn't like to quit on a location, so he's like, well, let's just do it real quick, and then we'll go. And there were some climbers actually starting to climb, so I warned them. I was like, this is what we're going to do. Don't be scared. Just let me know when it's safe to do it, because we didn't want to distract them and have them fall or anything like that. And I remember after the first couple shots, somebody just yelled out, that sounds really dope. And it was one of the climbers. The place was really nice because you could drive anywhere. Like, you could go off-road, and you can actually drive into the canyon if you wanted to. It just depended on how much you wanted to risk your vehicle, which was really nice about it. We actually drove around that place and captured like 7 different spots.
I think that speaks a lot to the attitude of like never settling and making sure that when you're out there, you're going to go get something that you're proud of, even when you run into obstacles. That's an important thing for people to have in their heads as they go out field recording, especially, complex things.
Totally. Because, yeah, it never goes as planned. You're always just kind of trying to compromise as best you can and, make sure you're leaving with something that you can work with.
Yeah, speaking of not going as planned, for one of the sessions, I was going to what is a ski resort of sorts at the top of a mountain. And after, again, 3 months of organizing, getting there with a pyrotechnician, there are snow cannons going right away in the morning, which are super loud and completely defeat the purpose of trying to find a place in the middle of nowhere in the top of a mountain for the most silent silence. Luckily, somehow they broke, or the water supply for them broke that morning. And so I ended up being able to record throughout the day. The second that I closed the suitcase at the end of the day with all the mics inside and I was done, they resumed firing snow. So again, things can go really wrong, or somehow you can get really lucky. I'm not really sure if I got lucky or if someone just kind of helped me or took mercy on me when they saw me arrive with all these microphones. But yeah, that was one of those things that could have been bad.
A snow cannon is something that makes fake snow on the mountain, right? We're talking about cannons that make noise. So that's probably just like a white noise generator type sound?
Yeah, this is not one of the good cannons we're talking about today. This is a cannon you should identify as the enemy. It's broadband noise. It's just, it sprinkles man-made snow on the hillside.
Yeah, that'd be a nightmare to show up and just hear all that rumbling away. Oh.
I was told that it would resume pretty much imminently and that I would not have time to record anything, but ultimately I was able to. So yeah, so many things that could have gone wrong with these recording sessions. One of them was also hiking with my girlfriend and our newborn baby on a trail that had a lot of blood along the way. This was like about 2 kilometers of just hiking on snow, the purest, whitest snow with just the freshest, reddest blood. And I think, again, Chloe, sorry, my daughter, if you're listening to this in a few years, it was most certainly animal blood. It was probably like a hunter or something, but it was one of those things like throughout we were like, will it be good? It was okay. It's just, small places in Italy, nothing that you create a Netflix series about. So
yeah, that would be alarming. So we've talked about all of the actual acoustic recordings, but this library also includes a bunch of design sounds. Do you want to talk about how those came to be?
Yeah, sure. So when I made my previous sound design library, meaning not animal-based Metamorphosis, I had the chance to scratch the surface with regards to textures that I thought were pleasing to me with a lot of what I would call microdynamics, like small transients that would make the sound feel quite crisp, taking advantage of cranking a synthesized sound where the signal-to-noise ratio will never be a problem. So thinking back to, again, some references that I mentioned, like Returnal, for example, or the Northman, there's so many textures that are super gritty that I think are almost unachievable in limiting yourself to use only recordings. So I try to get back to that and dig deeper into this idea of creating hyper-realistic textures in the context of a library that would feature explosions as well as trees cracking, so things that are sort of organic but not that much. For this part of the library, I did some of the work myself, and I used a number of synths, Pigments, Serum for the past one, Vital, and I got familiar with some of them because I never used them before. And then for another part of the synthesizer section, I was able to get in touch with Joe Ford, who helped a lot in creating the soundscape for that section. And he works quite differently from me. I wish that he was here to try and explain a little bit of, the nitty-gritty of his process, but it was completely different from mine. I think he works a lot more destructively from what I can tell, and he's really good at creating these textures that feel super full, rich, but also ambiguous. I would say very, very versatile, if that makes sense. So we worked together, although I started that work and then I let pretty much Joe finish that section. I got half of the way and he did the rest, and so I went back to listen to my early designs, and I think I scrapped about 30% of what I made because he raised the bar so much that some of the things that I originally made did not really fit anymore. They didn't have enough of the density, or maybe they just felt kind of like very quiet sounds cranked up, which ultimately would still get lost if you layered them with literally anything. So yeah, that part of the library came together in a very different way, but it was an awesome collaboration.
Well, the library sounds huge, so congratulations to everybody. Thanks for talking to us about it today. If listeners want to stay tuned, after we wrap up, we'll play some sounds from the library from the demo, if that's okay with you, Mattia.
Of course.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, everybody. It was great talking to you. It's great to meet you all.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having us.
Wow, listening to them makes me want to get a propane cannon for myself. Wonder if you can rent one anywhere. If you are in New York City or Toronto, make sure to come out to our upcoming sound design meetups, September 26th in Toronto and October 26th in New York. Go to tonebenderspodcast.com for all the details. This episode was volunteer edited and mixed by listener Jacob Wolf. Jacob is a sound designer based in Detroit, Michigan, working in commercials, theme parks, and interactive media. You can find him on LinkedIn for more info. Thanks a lot, Jacob. Stay tuned to hear more sounds from the Cataclysm library in just a few seconds. My name is Tim Muirhead, and on behalf of Mattia, Kyle, and Robbie, thanks for listening to Tonebenders.
Tonebenders is produced by Timothy Muirhead, René Coronado, and Teresa Morrow. Theme music is by Mark Strait. Send your emails to info@tonebenderspodcast.com. Follow us on Twitter via @thetonebenders, and join Tonebenders Podcast on Facebook. Support this podcast. You can use our links when you shop with Amazon or B&H, or leave us a tip. Just go to tonebenderspodcast.com and click the support button. Thanks for listening.
Are you looking for more audio-related podcasts to listen to? Tonebenders is part of the Audio Podcast Alliance, featuring a hand-picked selection of the very best podcasts about sound. Be sure to hear the latest episodes from our friends in the community at audiopodcast.org.